Well, there's a saying, there's no place like home, and that is especially true when we're talking about Gifford,
Illinois.
Gifford, Illinois. A small town in central Illinois you've probably never heard of before today. The whole town is about a mile by a mile. The population is just under 1,000 people. There's a gas station, a bank, a middle school, 3 bars, and 2 churches. It's a peaceful, wholesome community where everyone knows their neighbors and none of them would mind if you borrowed a cup of sugar. It's the quintessential small town, self-described by a sign at its entrance as America's hometown. It's also my hometown. I grew up in Gifford. It's always been a tight-knit community, and its residents are proud to call it home. For a little history on the town, Gifford was laid out in 1876 and existed as an unincorporated portion of what is called the Compromise Township. If you're not familiar with what a township is, it's essentially just organized local political representation for the people who inhabit an area of land within a county, but aren't clustered close together enough to justify classification as a town. There are a few unincorporated towns in the township, and Gifford sat as a portion of the township for nearly 80 years after being settled. It wasn't until 1954 when the people of Gifford decided to take the legal steps to become an incorporated town. The town is named after its planner, Benjamin Gifford. Mr. Gifford was an incredibly intelligent and successful man who was making huge negotiations on land purchases at the early age of 11. He was a promoter, a developer, a planner, an organizer, and a lawyer. Notably, Mr. Gifford also served under General Grant in the Civil War, where he was wounded twice and was eventually promoted to lieutenant. And as if all of this wasn't enough, he also had an enormous interest in the railroad system, held stakes in several railroads across the Midwest, and worked to plan and build railway systems. This is actually what led to the development of Gifford. Mr. Gifford's idea for the village was a community clustered along a train depot, which would be one of the stops along the railway system he was planning simultaneously. And although that railway system is now defunct, it was central in the town's creation and was the fastest way to travel, as the next best thing would have been horse and buggy. Since its establishment, Gifford has remained a pretty humble little town with not a lot of notoriety. Those who live locally may know Gifford as the town which held the German Fall Festival in the 70s, which was essentially an Oktoberfest that celebrated the large German population in the area. And while I have heard some crazy yet unconfirmed stories from these festivals, they were a major success from such a small town, attracting upwards of 20,000 people and raising a ton of money for the community. These don't happen anymore, but they're a huge part of the town's history, and even the community building in the middle of town has since been renamed the German Fall Festival Building. There are still a couple people that came from Gifford whose names you might recognize.
My name is Mike Frericks. I'm the Illinois State Treasurer. I've held that position for the last 4 years. Before that, I served in the Illinois State Senate. Before that, I was the Champaign County Auditor, where I became a certified public finance officer. I was the first in my family to graduate from university, and I came home with a desire to serve. I taught at my local high school and served as a volunteer firefighter in my hometown of Gifford, Illinois.
So Illinois residents may be familiar with Mike Frericks. I'm not sure how familiar others may be with him. Admittedly, I couldn't tell you who the treasurer was for any other state, so I can't expect anyone outside of Illinois to recognize him unless you pay close attention to other states' politics. But Mike Frericks has been the treasurer of Illinois since 2014, who happens to also be from Gifford.
I'm Michelle Franzen in New York. This is an ABC News Digital special report. His capture over the weekend hailed as a major blow to the global drug trade.
And you may be familiar with this voice as well. That was Michelle Franzen, an award-winning journalist who has worked for several major national news outlets, including NBC and ABC. And while she currently lives in New York City, even her Twitter bio says that she's a small-town girl at heart, having also called Gifford her hometown before making a successful career as a journalist. So Gifford has produced a few successes in its time, which is a great fun fact about the village. But most of the people from Gifford are happy with their quiet successes and are proud to call the quaint little town their home. And it was my home for many years. I no longer live in Gifford after going to college and getting a job, but I still have family and friends who live there, and it will always be my hometown. I lived in 2 different houses in Gifford. I went to Gifford grade school from kindergarten to 8th grade. My dad still lives there, and my mother is buried there. I have a lot of memories of that little town. Playing in the park after school, foursquare and basketball in the school's parking lot, riding bikes around town with friends, jumping on the trampoline in the backyard with my neighbor with a hose going underneath it pointed upwards like a sprinkler, going to one of the restaurants in town called the Long Branch with friends and treating ourselves to possibly the best French fries I have ever had in my entire life. I've watched businesses come and go, or thrive in some cases. I watched as the Gifford State Bank, where my mom worked, expand to 4 locations and bring a fresh life to Main Street after some major renovations. I remember when Park Street didn't have any stop signs, and when they did get installed, I remember people having a hard time adjusting to slowing down through there, which was kind of the point, I think. But even my brother got a ticket for running one of those stop signs early on because he was just kind of on autopilot and forgot they were there. I could go on and on about all the memories I have in Gifford, and there are a lot of them. But there's a reason I have such fond memories of my hometown, and it has nothing to do with enjoying small-town living or being away from a big, busy city. Those things are true aspects of life in Gifford, but I've never had any particular disdain for large cities. In fact, I always thought it would be great to experience living in a city like Chicago or St. Louis, or just any city with name recognition like that. And while the majority of the people who live in Gifford likely don't share these sentiments, the people are exactly what made growing up in Gifford such a great experience. I like to say about Gifford that it's a small town where everyone knows everyone. And, well, that's not really true. It's impossible to know every single person in town. 1,000 people doesn't make up a large town, but 1,000 people is a lot of people to know personally. So I can't say I know everyone from Gifford, especially not now after having lived elsewhere for about 12 years. But the people I do know or did know shaped my childhood. Like my youth group leader who, even though she had to deal with a lot of opinionated teenagers, tried her best to make every experience in the group worthwhile. Or the ladies at the bank who I probably annoyed endlessly by stopping in after school to see my mom, but still could not have been nicer to me. Or the grade school teachers who I'm sure dreaded my yearly after-school visits to their classrooms to ask if they would donate money to whatever fundraiser I was doing for church or Boy Scouts that year, but still gave what they could and did so with a smile. Gifford is a great place to live because of the people who live there. The people there are kind, they're generous, and they truly want what's best for all of their neighbors. But don't just take it from me. Listen to what just a few of Gifford's residents have to say about their life in the village.
I grew up in Gifford, and I love how close-knit of a community it is and how we really come together for celebrations and if somebody needs help. And so I've loved bringing my children here to grow up so that they can see that as well.
I love living in Gifford. I love that I grew up in Gifford. I have so many memories of living in Gifford and just having so much fun, from learning how to ride my bike to riding my bike with friends in the summer, going to the Gifford celebrations, going to the park, getting to decorate ornaments and take them up to the tree every Christmas, or dressing up and going to the nursing home every Halloween. Just so many memories that I'll hold forever, and hopefully I get to share with my family and they get to make some memories in Gifford growing up as well.
So these were just a few examples from residents who are willing to be recorded. Gifford is a small town, so naturally the people who live there lead pretty private lives, and being recorded for a podcast takes a lot of people out of their comfort zone. But overwhelmingly, people have the same sentiments. Other residents who weren't as comfortable being recorded were still willing to share some words with me through social media on their thoughts of living in the town. Here's just a couple comments from some of these residents as well. One resident said, "I love small town living. Things are different than when we moved into town in 1973. I used to know almost everyone, but now I know far less residents. That doesn't change the fact that there are really good people in Gifford. It's quiet and even has some unique shops and a wonderful restaurant 5 evenings a week, among other businesses. I couldn't think of another town I'd rather live in." Another resident said, "I like living in Gifford because of the great people that make up our community. Our town is blessed with wonderful businesses, a great school, and residents that truly care about one another and the town we live in. I love that no matter where you go, you will often be greeted with a friendly wave or a hello." And these aren't just words either. The overall sense of community in Gifford was put to a real test just a few years ago when the town was given the rare opportunity to show off its strength by overcoming devastation.
The date was Sunday, November 17th, 2013.
The time was around 1 o'clock when an incoming storm dropped a funnel cloud out of the sky, which became a tornado just west of Thomasboro, then proceeded to move across the midsection of Gifford on the edge of the downtown.
We heard the sirens go off, but the sirens have gone off in my life, 50 times.
And I thought I was going to take a right turn, but it came right at us and got closer and closer and started picking things up and throwing them.
And I saw it coming down Main Street, just all the debris and everything just flying.
While I wasn't living in Gifford at the time of the tornado, I was actually there when it ripped through the town. In fact, a big portion of my extended family was in town that day, as my mother had just gotten out of the hospital that very morning. Weather teams tracked a total of 10 tornadoes in Illinois that day, but the worst damage by far was done in the towns of Gifford and Washington, another town about 17 times the size of Gifford and about an hour and a half to the northwest. The destruction was unimaginable. My family was extremely lucky for our home to not have been in the direct path of the tornado. At the worst, we lost a few shingles and had some damage to our garage door. But others weren't so lucky. Some people's homes were completely gone, reduced to just piles of rubble. Houses of friends I went to grade school with, where I can remember spending afternoons after school playing games and having fun, were just gone. Luckily, no one was killed from the unexpected tornado, but its damage left a large portion of Gifford's residents without a place to live, and everyone was without electricity or running water for quite some time. The devastation was so bad that volunteers with the Red Cross from all over the country came to help with the cleanup efforts, while FEMA stepped in to provide water and other supplies to all of the town's residents. And while the tornado damage was huge news, the real story here is how well the community banded together with a determination to not only clean up, but to rebuild. Fundraisers were held, benefit concerts were organized, and shelters were established. But these things are common after any kind of disaster. The empathy, strength, and clearly displayed desire to help one another in the face of this challenge is what truly makes Gifford special. People invited their neighbors into their homes, kept them fed, made sure to provide anything that they could. The local churches provided meals, water, and supplies to those in need, all organized from donations and distributed by volunteers. Some residents formed their own fundraisers to go towards relief efforts by designing and selling t-shirts that read "Gifford Strong," which you could see being worn proudly by community members there as well as in several of the neighboring towns. In fact, I still have mine that I wear occasionally today. The efforts of the community to band together during such a nightmarish situation was undeniably inspiring. So much so, in fact, that a local country music artist by the name of David Howie decided to write a song about it.
Gifford and Washington, it ain't over yet. Gifford and Washington, we will not forget. Neighbor up and neighbor, trying to find the joy. Gifford and Washington, Illinois. Gifford and Washington, Illinois.
The point of all of this is that Gifford is a strong community whose residents look out for one another. And while the tornado is just one extremely visible example of this, the day-to-day life in the town before the tornado and post-rebuild is easygoing and carefree. It's a safe place to live, where people can stroll around town on bicycles and golf carts without a worry in the world. People's kids can play around town without the parents really needing to worry about them getting into trouble. It's a community that is truly the envy of other local towns who wish they could model themselves in the same way. Gifford has never really been a place where you had to worry about crime. It's listed as being in the top 7% of safest towns in the entire United States. Of course, no place is perfect. Even Andy Griffith's Mayberry had its incidents. But the crime rate in Gifford is so low that their one and only police officer is just about as busy as Barney Fife when it comes to controlling crime in the town. Crime in the area is so low, in fact, that if something does happen, everyone knows about it and it's probably a top story at the local news stations. But this is usually like petty theft, some kind of vandalism, a fight, things that pop up in any community, even the safe ones. But when you truly think about the quote-unquote dangerous crimes like murder, rape, robbery, and assault, you would be hard-pressed to find a handful of examples coming from Gifford. That doesn't mean none have ever occurred, but they are extremely rare. In fact, only one murder has ever occurred in the village of Gifford. And just for fun, I'm going to briefly tell you about this case. After all, two of my main interests with this podcast are true crime and history, and this is a little bit of both. To be clear, this is just a little side story and will not be the focus of this series. But I can't just not talk about it, and to be honest, even though this is going to be a story about murder, it still speaks to the idea that Gifford's residents have always been honest people, even when an anomaly such as this takes place. This took place in February of 1894. A quote from the Champaign County Gazette, a newspaper no longer in circulation, had this to say about the incident. A painful tragedy in the town of Gifford, the result of a local feud. Thomas Gallagher, a well-known hardware merchant, fatally shoots Charles Taylor, local butcher, then comes in town with his friends and gives himself up to the officers of the law. Unsurprisingly, there's not a lot of information out there about this incident. Luckily, in celebration of the town's centennial in 1975, a few amateur local historians put together an admittedly incomplete yet still very thorough book of Gifford's history in which they briefly describe the murder and the events surrounding it. It's not clear what their sources are for the information provided, other than the brief quote from the cited newspaper. So while we do know a murder took place almost 130 years ago, I can't be sure how accurate the story told in this book is, as it seems to be mostly a story passed down verbally and not one that was well documented. Nonetheless, the story described in the Centennial book is that Thomas Gallagher was a successful businessman who ran a hardware store in town. Charles Taylor was a local butcher who seemed to have a drinking problem, as did his 18-year-old son, Johnny, who drunkenly stumbled into Mr. Gallagher's hardware store with a bottle of whiskey and tried to get Mr. Gallagher to have a few drinks with him. Of course, Mr. Gallagher refused, which made young Johnny upset. Later on that day, Johnny returned to the hardware store and continued harassing Mr. Gallagher to drink with him, which forced Mr. Gallagher to kick him out of the business. Now, in my mind, if you found out your 18-year-old son was walking into businesses and drunkenly demanding that people start partying with him, you would think your first response would be to get upset with the kid. But Mr. Taylor wasn't upset with Johnny, he was upset with Mr. Gallagher, supposedly going around town telling people he was going to kill Mr. Gallagher within the next 24 hours. And so, that evening he went to Mr. Gallagher's house where he demanded to confront the hardware salesman, shooting his shotgun in the air a couple times to let him know he meant business. However, it appears Mr. Gallagher did not pay Mr. Taylor any attention, as he never left his home or responded to the man, and Mr. Taylor eventually just went home. The next time they saw each other, Mr. Gallagher had gone to the depot where Mr. Charles physically attacked him, striking him in the face. Mr. Gallagher stood his ground and drew his revolver. When Mr. Taylor attempted to strike him a second time, Mr. Gallagher shot him. He then got on the train, took it down to the police station in Urbana, Illinois, and immediately turned himself in. Mr. Gallagher was arrested on the spot and spent several days in jail, but was eventually found not guilty and was acquitted of all charges against him. The Centennial book that tells this story explicitly calls it a murder in Gifford, but most people might simply call this self-defense, and they wouldn't be wrong. Likely, that's why Mr. Gallagher was found not guilty in this case. So with that being said, we can't confirm a single case of cold-blooded, calculated murder that took place in the village of Gifford. But the key word there is in Gifford. There are a couple other cases worth mentioning when we talk about Gifford. One of them is the 1997 disappearance of Heather Dawn Mullen Zimmerman, who went missing after attending a party outside of town that Memorial Day weekend. Heather's case is still unsolved and is potentially linked to another local girl's disappearance as well. This is still a hard subject for Heather's family, so I will just leave her story at that. But this is still an ongoing investigation, as Heather's whereabouts are still unknown 24 years later. There is one case that's slightly older than that and is also worth talking about here. This one took place on a rural farm just outside of Gifford, or at least that's the story that was told in court. This case is technically closed, although it doesn't quite sound like justice was ever served on this one. In August of 1984, a young woman's badly decomposed body was found in a wooded area just a few miles northwest of Gifford. And, rumor has it, this isn't the only body that can be found in that area. Next time on So You Want Me to Believe.